I'm Morgan, 28, standing on the dock at our annual family reunion when my brother Harry grabs my shoulders from behind. "Loosen up, sis." Then a violent shove. Water engulfs me. My lungs seize. Childhood pneumonia left me with respiratory issues. Breaking the surface, I gasp desperately while Harry laughs. "Don't be so dramatic," he smirks. Mom and Dad watch silently. Something inside me snaps. They'd soon learn I wasn't being dramatic. I was done. If you're watching this story unfold, where are you tuning in from? Hit like and subscribe before I reveal how I made sure Harry's $60,000 MBA fund found a better purpose. Growing up in suburban Massachusetts, I always understood my place in the family hierarchy. Harry, 3 years my senior, was the golden child, captain of the debate team, high school valedictorian, and Ivy League graduate. Meanwhile, I was the afterthought, the sensitive one whose achievements were acknowledged with polite nods rather than the celebrations Harry received. My career as a financial advisor in Boston actually outpaced Harry's middling performance at his father's friend's investment firm, but you'd never know it from family conversations. While I built my client list through hard work and networking, Harry coasted on connections and charm. Yet every holiday dinner, my parents fawned over his mediocre accomplishments, while mine warranted brief mentions. "Morgan manages other people's money," my father would explain to relatives, before eagerly adding, "but Harry's positioned to move into upper management next year." The bullying started when I was 6 and Harry was 9. He'd take my toys, claiming he was just borrowing them, only to return them broken. When I'd cry, my parents would sigh, "He's just being a boy. You're too sensitive." By middle school, his tactics evolved. He'd wait until my friends were over to share embarrassing stories, always ending with, "I'm just joking around." Morgan can't take a joke. My humiliation became his entertainment, and my parents became his enablers. The respiratory issues began after a severe case of pneumonia when I was 11. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital while my lungs struggled to clear. The experience left me with diminished lung capacity and occasional breathing difficulties, especially during physical exertion or stress. Harry knew this. He'd seen my prescribed breathing exercises and emergency inhaler. He'd witnessed my panic when I couldn't catch my breath. Our family wasn't struggling financially. Dad's engineering firm provided a comfortable upper-middle-class lifestyle, and education was positioned as the ultimate priority. "We're investing in your futures," Mom would say when explaining why we vacationed locally instead of internationally like my friends' families. This investment, however, wasn't distributed equally. When Harry went to college, my parents covered every expense: tuition, housing, meal plans, even spending money. For me, they contributed to tuition but expected me to work part-time and take out loans for the rest. "Harry's program is more demanding," they explained. "You can handle working while studying." I graduated with $42,000 in student debt. Harry graduated debt-free. The annual family reunion at Lake Winnipesaukee was a tradition started by my grandparents 30 years ago. As the extended family grew, so did the event, expanding to a full week with various branches of the family occupying neighboring cabins along the shoreline. It was supposed to be about connection and celebration, but for me, it became an annual exercise in emotional endurance. I nearly skipped this year's reunion. My financial advising practice had just landed 2 significant clients, and the timing was terrible. But my mother's guilt-laden phone calls wore me down. "Family comes first, Morgan. We only do this once a year." What she didn't say, but I understood, Harry would be there, and the family narrative required both children to perform their roles: the golden son and the dutiful daughter. What my parents didn't know was how much Harry resented my recent success. 3 months earlier, we'd crossed paths at an industry conference in New York. After a few drinks, his facade slipped. "Must be nice playing the diversity card," he'd sneered, implying my success came from being a woman in finance rather than my 70-hour work weeks and client satisfaction ratings. "Some of us actually have to prove ourselves." The lake incident wasn't isolated. It was merely the final beat on a decades-long string of cruelty. There was the time Harry told my first boyfriend I was emotionally unstable at prom, leading to our breakup. The graduation party where he accidentally spilled red wine on my white dress minutes before family photos. The Thanksgiving he brought up my failed business venture from years prior, framing it as a funny story about Morgan's big ideas. Each incident was followed by the same refrain, "Don't be so dramatic." For words that gaslight me into questioning my own reality, my own pain. For words that gave him permission to continue, that told him there would never be consequences. What made this time different wasn't the act itself. It was the realization that nothing would ever change unless I changed it. As I stood dripping on that dock, lungs burning and family watching, I understood that I'd been waiting for an acknowledgement that would never come. The first day of the reunion began like all others, with forced smiles and superficial conversation. I arrived at the main cabin around noon, having deliberately scheduled a client call that morning to delay my appearance. The lakeside property looked picturesque as always, crystal blue water stretching toward distant pines, white cabins dotting the shoreline, and the main lodge with its sprawling deck where most gatherings took place. "Morgan's finally here," my mother announced as I walked in, as though my slightly late arrival was some character flaw worth highlighting. Harry was already holding court on the deck, cousins laughing at whatever story he was telling. Aunt Patricia hugged me. "How's the money business?" she asked, the same question she'd asked for 5 years straight. "It's financial advising, and it's going well," I replied, the correction falling on deaf ears as usual. The afternoon progressed with the typical reunion activities. A potluck lunch where everyone praised my mother's mediocre potato salad, family updates delivered like press releases, and the undercurrent of competition barely concealed beneath talk of children's achievements and home renovations. Harry made sure to position himself near me throughout the day, delivering small jabs disguised as brotherly banter. "Still driving that old Honda?" "I thought financial advisors made decent money," he said loudly enough for nearby relatives to hear. "That blazer's a bit corporate for a family reunion, isn't it? Always working, our Morgan." Each comment was designed to undermine, to remind me of my place. I mostly ignored him, which only prompted him to try harder. By late afternoon, the younger cousins suggested swimming, and most of the family migrated toward the dock. I hadn't planned to swim and was still in my linen pants and sleeveless blouse, sitting on one of the Adirondack chairs watching the others. The sun was beginning its descent, casting golden light across the water. In another context, with different company, it might have been peaceful. I didn't hear Harry approach from behind. The first indication of his presence was his voice, too close to my ear. "You look too dry, sis." Before I could react, his hands were on my shoulders. I remember the momentary confusion, the split second where I couldn't quite process what was happening. Then the sensation of being lifted slightly and propelled forward. The fall seemed to happen in slow motion. I saw the weathered wood of the dock edge, then open air, then the lake's surface rushing toward me. I didn't have time to take a breath before hitting the water. The shock of cold was immediate and disorienting. Water filled my nose, my mouth. My clothes became instantly heavy, dragging me deeper than the initial fall should have. Panic set in as my body remembered another time, another struggle for air. I was 9 years old again, at swim lessons. A boy had held me underwater as a joke, not realizing I couldn't hold my breath as long as the other kids. The instructor pulled me out, but not before I'd inhaled water, triggering a respiratory episode that sent me to the emergency room. Now, nearly 20 years later, the same primal fear engulfed me. My lungs, already compromised, seemed to collapse inward. I kicked desperately, clothes tangling around my legs. The surface seemed impossibly far away, though logically I knew the dock was only about 5 feet above the water. When I finally broke through, the sound that came from me wasn't a scream, but a ragged, desperate gasp. My lungs burned as though filled with ground glass. Each breath was shallow and insufficient, my body demanding oxygen I couldn't provide quickly enough. Through water-blurred vision, I saw faces peering down from the dock. Expressions of surprise, concern, but primarily discomfort, the family's usual response to anything disrupting their preferred narrative of harmony. Harry's laugh cut through my panic. "Look at her face. You'd think she was dying or something." I grabbed the dock ladder, hands shaking so badly I nearly missed the rungs. Cousin Beth reached down to help, but withdrew when Harry spoke again. "Don't be so dramatic, Morgan. It's just water. Everyone else is swimming." I pulled myself up, water streaming from my clothes, hair plastered to my face. My breathing was still labored, coming in short, painful bursts. The family watched, a semicircle of uncomfortable spectators. "Morgan," my mother finally said, her voice carrying that familiar note of disappointment, "you're making a scene. Go change into something dry." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Harry, apologize to your sister." Just concern for appearances, for maintaining the illusion that everything was fine. My father handed me a towel without meeting my eyes. "You know how Harry jokes around. Don't take it so personally." In that moment, something crystallized within me, a clarity I'd never experienced before. Nothing would change. Harry would always be the son who could do no wrong. I would always be too sensitive, too dramatic. My parents would always enable and excuse. I wrapped the towel around my shoulders and walked away without a word. Behind me, conversation resumed, the incident already being reframed as a funny anecdote rather than an assault. By dinner, it would be Morgan's dramatic episode at the dock, another family story at my expense. In my cabin, peeling off wet clothes and struggling to normalize my breathing, I made a decision. This would be the last family reunion I would attend. But simply walking away didn't feel sufficient after decades of accumulated injustice. For the first time, I allowed myself to truly feel the anger I'd suppressed for years. It wasn't hot and explosive as I'd feared, but cold and clarifying. I would no longer participate in my own diminishment. And Harry would finally learn that actions have consequences. Back in my cabin, I showered and changed, my breathing gradually returning to normal though my chest still ached. Rather than rejoining the family for the evening barbecue, I opened my laptop and connected to the cabin's Wi-Fi. What began as a distraction, checking work emails, reviewing client portfolios, evolved into something else entirely. 2 years ago, in what my parents considered a gesture of trust and practicality, they had appointed me as the family's financial advisor. The irony wasn't lost on me. They trusted my professional judgment with their retirement accounts, but dismissed my personal boundaries in family matters. Initially, I'd been touched by what seemed like recognition of my expertise, but eventually realized it was primarily about the family discount they received on my services. I logged into the secure portal where I managed their accounts, including the educational trust fund established for Harry's upcoming MBA program. He'd finally decided, at 31, that an advanced degree might help him ascend the corporate ladder he'd been stuck on despite his supposedly superior talents. The account held slightly over $60,000, money my parents had diligently saved to ensure Harry could attend business school without the burden of loans. No similar account had ever been established for me, despite my expressed interest in pursuing a master's degree in financial planning. "Your undergraduate degree is sufficient for your field," my father had explained when I brought it up last Christmas. "Harry needs the MBA to compete at his level." I navigated through the account details, familiar with every aspect of its structure. As their financial advisor, I had fiduciary responsibility, a legal obligation to manage these funds in their best interest. But the account had a particular feature that suddenly seemed significant. I had been granted limited power of attorney for financial matters, allowing me to make transactions on their behalf. This arrangement was common among my older clients who wanted protection in case of emergency or incapacity, but unusual for clients my parents' age. They had insisted on it, however, after a family friend experienced a health crisis that left their finances in disarray. "We trust you to handle things properly," my mother had said when signing the paperwork. That trust now presented an opportunity one had never considered before. The power of attorney didn't give me ownership of their funds, but it did give me authority to direct them. I couldn't legally take the money for myself, nor would I want to, but I could potentially redirect it. I stared at the screen, a plan forming that simultaneously thrilled and terrified me. Was I really considering this? The ethical implications were complex. As a financial professional, I operated under strict codes of conduct. But as a family member who had suffered decades of emotional abuse enabled by financial favoritism, I saw a rare chance for consequential action. I remembered my own student loan statements, the monthly payments that had constrained my budget for years, while Harry lived in a luxury apartment our parents subsidized. I thought about the breathless excitement with which my parents had announced they'd saved enough for Harry's MBA, with no acknowledgement of the disparity in how they'd supported our respective educations. The technical aspects were straightforward. I could execute a transfer to a nonprofit educational foundation, structuring it as a charitable donation in my parents' names. They would even receive a tax benefit, though that wasn't my primary concern. The key was finding an organization whose mission would be meaningful, one that would use the funds for something more valuable than furthering Harry's unearned advantages. For 2 hours, I researched educational charities, evaluating their financials, mission statements, and impact reports. Eventually, I found it, the Breathing Room Foundation, which provided educational scholarships specifically for young adults who had overcome respiratory challenges and medical trauma. Their scholarship recipients included ambitious students whose medical conditions had created educational obstacles, people who had faced genuine struggles rather than being cushioned from consequences. The symmetry felt appropriate. Money intended to advance Harry's career would instead support individuals who had overcome actual challenges, including respiratory issues like mine. I wasn't naive about the fallout this would create. My parents would be furious. Harry would be livid. My professional reputation could suffer if the situation became public, though I was confident the transaction itself would be legally defensible given my authorization. To protect myself, I began documenting the transaction carefully, creating a paper trail that framed it as a legitimate charitable contribution made in accordance with my client's stated values of educational advancement. I drafted a formal investment recommendation memo, similar to those I prepared for all client transactions, detailing the tax advantages and philanthropic benefits. The final step would be the hardest, executing the transfer. Once done, it couldn't be easily reversed without the charity's cooperation. This wasn't a decision to make impulsively, especially given the professional ramifications. I closed my laptop without completing the transaction. I needed time to consider all angles, to be certain this was a line I was willing to cross. As the sound of laughter drifted from the main cabin, I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling, calculating risks and weighing consequences. By morning, I knew exactly what I would do, and what would come after. I woke before sunrise, the cabin still dark and quiet. Sleep had been fitful, but my resolve had solidified overnight. This wasn't just about the lake incident or even about Harry specifically, it was about breaking a pattern that had defined my entire life. If my family wouldn't recognize the imbalance, I would force the equilibrium myself. My first action was to secure my own future. I called my assistant in Boston, catching her just as she arrived at the office. "Brenda, I need you to prepare the client transition documents we discussed last month," I said, referring to our contingency planning. I'm accelerating my timeline for the satellite office. For nearly a year, I'd been laying groundwork to expand my practice to Chicago, drawn by the city's vibrant financial sector and personal distance from Boston's constant reminders of family obligation. The lake incident had transformed this potential someday plan into an immediate necessity. "Everything okay, Morgan?" Brenda asked, concern evident in her voice. "Just time for a change," I replied. "I'll email you the details this afternoon." With my professional transition initiated, I turned back to my laptop and logged into the family account portal. The $60,000 sat there, ostensibly waiting for Harry's educational enlightenment. I pulled up the donation forms for the Breathing Room Foundation I'd reviewed the night before. The process was straightforward: fund transfer, donor information, purpose designation. I listed my parents as the primary donors, using their home address and contact information. In the special instructions field, I specified that the donation should establish a named scholarship fund for students with respiratory conditions pursuing financial education, an irony Harry would eventually appreciate, if not immediately. Before finalizing the transaction, I created comprehensive documentation, confirmation emails, transaction receipts, the foundation's acknowledgement, all saved to a secure cloud folder. I wasn't covering my tracks. I was creating a deliberate paper trail that framed this as an intentional, charitable action rather than an impulsive act of revenge. The moment of execution was surprisingly anticlimactic. A few clicks, a confirmation dialogue, and $60,000 disappeared from one account and materialized in another. The foundation's automatic response appeared almost instantly. Heartfelt thanks for the generous contribution that would help deserving students overcome medical and financial obstacles. I forwarded this acknowledgement to my own personal email, then logged out of the family account portal for what I knew would be the final time. The transaction was complete, but my plan was only half executed. The next phase required personal preparations. I called my realtor in Chicago, confirming that the apartment I'd viewed virtually the previous month was still available. "I'll take it," I said, authorizing the security deposit transfer. "I can sign the lease electronically today." My resignation letter to my firm had been drafted weeks ago, needing only minor adjustments. I emphasized the opportunity for growth in a new market rather than any dissatisfaction with my current position. My clients would be distributed among colleagues I respected, with the option for them to transfer to my Chicago practice once established, if they preferred. The most challenging document was the letter to my parents. I wrote and rewrote it several times, alternating between detailed explanations of lifelong grievances and sparse declarations of independence. The final version struck a balance. Mom and Dad. By the time you read this, I will have relocated to Chicago to expand my practice. This decision follows years of consideration and recent events that confirmed it's necessary for my well-being. You'll soon discover that Harry's education fund has been redirected to establish a scholarship for students with respiratory conditions. This was done using the financial authority you granted me, channeling family resources toward a cause that reflects genuine need rather than continued preference. This isn't a hasty reaction, but the culmination of a lifetime of imbalance. I don't expect you to understand immediately, but I hope eventually you'll recognize that this outcome stems from patterns you established and maintained. I'm not angry anymore. I'm simply finished. Please respect my decision by not attempting to contact me for the foreseeable future. Morgan. I sealed the letter in an envelope to be left on my bed when I departed. The foundation would send their own formal acknowledgement of the donation to my parents' home address within days, providing external confirmation of the transaction. The remainder of the day passed in calculated normalcy. I joined family activities, smiled at appropriate moments, and even tolerated Harry's continued jibes with unprecedented serenity. My newfound calm seemed to unsettle him more than any reaction could have. "What's with the Buddha act?" he asked during the afternoon volleyball game. "Still sulking about getting wet yesterday?" "Just gaining perspective," I replied, my smile genuine for the first time in days. The knowledge of what I'd done, and what I was about to do, provided a satisfaction deeper than any verbal response could convey. That evening, I excused myself early, citing work commitments. In my cabin, I packed efficiently, leaving behind only what was unnecessary. My flight to Chicago was booked for 7 a.m. the following morning from the regional airport, long before anyone would typically awaken at the reunion. As night fell over Lake Winnipesaukee, I sat on my cabin's small porch, watching darkness settle across the water. Tomorrow, Harry would still be Harry, and my parents would still enable him. But for the first time, there would be consequences, and I would be free of the obligation to witness it all with silent acquiescence. The plan was executed. All that remained was my own disappearance. My new Chicago apartment overlooked Millennium Park, the urban landscape a deliberate contrast to New England's familiar shores. I had been in the city for 3 days when the first text messages began flooding my phone. "What the hell did you do?" Harry's all-caps rage required no interpretation. My mother's approach was more measured, but equally pointed. "Morgan, there's been some confusion with the accounts. Call immediately." My father, typically the most reserved, sent the most revealing message. "Your mother is very upset." This is extremely disappointing behavior. Not "what happened?" or "Are you okay?" Just immediate assumption of wrongdoing on my part, despite the perfectly documented charitable transaction in their names. I didn't respond to any of them, instead focusing on establishing my new office space and connecting with potential Chicago clients. The distance, both physical and emotional, provided clarity I hadn't experienced in years. The voicemails escalated over the next 48 hours. The business school called about my tuition deposit. Harry ranted in his third message. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was? Fix this now." My mother's messages transitioned from confusion to hurt. "I don't understand why you would do this without discussing it with us first. We've always supported your decisions." This particular revision of history almost made me break my silence. They had never supported my decisions. They had tolerated them when inconvenient and undermined them when they diverged from the family narrative. On the fifth day, the family lawyer called. I let that go to voicemail as well. "Morgan, this is Richard Blanchard. Your parents have asked me to look into the matter of the transferred education funds. Please call my office at your earliest convenience to discuss potential remediation options before we explore more formal avenues." The implied legal threat was expected, but ultimately toothless. I had documented everything meticulously, and while the ethics might be questionable, the legality was sound. They had granted me financial authority, and I had directed funds to a legitimate charitable organization aligned with educational purposes. What I hadn't anticipated was Harry's next move. Unable to reach me directly, he began contacting my colleagues in Boston, first under the pretense of trying to locate me, then openly disparaging my professional conduct. "Brenda called to warn me. Some guy claiming to be your brother has called the office 3 times today. He started asking if anyone knew where you were, but the last time he was telling anyone who would listen that you misappropriated family funds. Marcus told him to leave or he'd call security." I was grateful for my firm's loyalty, but concerned about potential reputational damage. I drafted a brief, factual email to the partners explaining that I had managed a family charitable donation before my departure that was being characterized inaccurately by a disappointed relative. I attached the documentation showing the legitimate nature of the transaction. "This is a personal family matter that has no bearing on client funds or firm practices," I concluded. "I apologize for any disruption this may cause." Their response was supportive, if cautious. The managing partner called personally. "Family business can get messy," he said. "Just keep it contained, and we'll consider this matter closed from the firm's perspective." By the second week, the direct attacks evolved into family division. My Aunt Patricia, always closer to me than my parents, had been called with genuine concern. "Morgan, are you safe? Your mother is telling everyone you had some kind of breakdown and stole money from them." "I'm fine, Aunt Pat," I assured her, breaking my silence selectively. I made a documented charitable donation using the financial authority they granted me. They're upset about the specific charity I chose. "And you moved to Chicago without telling anyone?" I needed a fresh start. The lake incident was just the final push. There was a long pause before she responded. "Harry always did go too far with his jokes. Your grandfather and I saw it even when you were kids." That simple acknowledgement, the first time any family member had validated my experience without qualification, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "Thank you for saying that," I managed. "Not everyone's against you, honey. Some of us have just been too quiet for too long." The family fracture lines became increasingly defined over the following days. My father's siblings largely supported my parents' narrative of my betrayal. My mother's side, who had witnessed more of Harry's behavior over the years, was more divided. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years reached out, some with judgment, others with tentative support. The most satisfying moment came unexpectedly via a professional email from the Breathing Room Foundation. They wanted to inform me that the Morgan Family Scholarship had received its first applicants, and the selection committee was reviewing candidates with respiratory conditions who sought financial education degrees. I forwarded this email, the only communication I initiated, to Harry's account with a single added line: "Your MBA fund is helping people who actually deserve an education." His response was immediate and vitriolic, a paragraph of threats and insults that revealed more about his character than he realized. The final line was telling, "You've ruined everything. Mom and Dad won't even talk about helping me with tuition now." So there it was, the actual consequence. Not just the loss of funds, but the first crack in the foundation of enabling that had supported his behavior for decades. My parents, forced to examine the financial favoritism made explicit by my actions, couldn't simply replace the money without acknowledging the imbalance. The most unexpected call came nearly 3 weeks after I left New Hampshire. My father, whose voice sounded older than I remembered, left a message that contained no demands or accusations. "Morgan, it's Dad. I found your inhaler in the cabin after you left. I forgot you still carried one. I didn't realize the water would. Just call us when you're ready." It wasn't an apology, not explicitly, but it was the first acknowledgement that perhaps, just perhaps, I hadn't been dramatic after all. Chicago embraced me with the indifference of any major city toward a newcomer, a refreshing change from the suffocating familiarity of Boston's financial district where my family connections followed me like a shadow. Here, I was simply Morgan, financial advisor, new tenant in apartment 1203, regular at the corner coffee shop. No history, no expectations, no role to fulfill in anyone else's narrative. My new office space in the financial district featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. I'd deliberately chosen a building with no existing connections to my former firm or family associates. The blank slate extended to my professional identity as well. I would build this practice solely on my own merit. The first month passed in a productive blur of logistics, business licenses, office setup, marketing materials, website development. I hired a local assistant, Zoe, whose efficiency and directness made Brenda's occasional walking on eggshells approach seem tiresome in retrospect. When I mentioned this observation during our weekly call, Brenda laughed. "You're different now," she noted. "More direct yourself. It suits you." She was right. Without the constant accommodation of family dynamics, I spoke more freely, made decisions more confidently. The energy previously devoted to navigating Harry's provocations and my parents' expectations now fueled professional innovation and personal discovery. I found a therapist specializing in family trauma, Dr. Elaine Marshall, whose office was walking distance from my apartment. Our first session began awkwardly. I'd never spoken so openly about family dynamics with an outside observer. "I think I did something unethical," I admitted halfway through our session, describing the fund redirection. Dr. Marshall's response surprised me. "Before we analyze the ethics of your action, can we examine the ethics of the situation that preceded it? You've described decades of differential treatment, emotional manipulation, and an incident that triggered genuine physical distress, which was then dismissed. But 2 wrongs don't make a right," I countered, voicing the platitude my mother had repeated throughout my childhood. "Perhaps not," she agreed. "But identifying patterns of harm doesn't require you to maintain your position in those patterns. You broke the cycle. Dramatically, yes, but cycles rarely break gently." These weekly conversations became anchoring points as I established my new life. Dr. Marshall helped me recognize family dynamics I'd normalized, how Harry's jokes were actually bullying, how my parents' expectations were actually favoritism, how my sensitivity was actually appropriate boundary setting that had been systematically undermined. As September arrived, so did the first holiday I'd spend away from family, Labor Day, typically marked by the final beach barbecue of summer at my parents' coastal home. Instead, I accepted an invitation from Zoe to join her friends gathering at North Avenue Beach. The day passed in pleasant conversation with strangers who held no preconceptions about me, who laughed with rather than at me, who asked questions and actually listened to my answers. "You seem surprised when people find you interesting," observed Kai, one of Zoe's friends, as we watched the sunset over Lake Michigan. "Do I?" I smiled, realizing he was right. "I guess I'm used to being background noise." By October, my Chicago practice had acquired its first dozen clients. My decision to specialize in financial planning for medical professionals, inspired partly by my own respiratory history, was proving strategically sound. Chicago's extensive hospital systems provided a robust client base of doctors, specialists, and healthcare administrators seeking investment guidance. My apartment gradually transformed from a functional space to a personal sanctuary. Unlike my Boston condo, decorated in the conservative style my mother considered appropriate for a financial professional, my Chicago home reflected emerging aspects of my personality: bold, abstract art, vibrant textiles, plants crowding the windowsills. I painted one wall a deep teal, something my mother would have deemed too dramatic for a living space. The irony of that particular criticism wasn't lost on me. As holidays approached, the communication attempts from family intensified. My mother's texts became increasingly manipulative. "We won't have a complete Thanksgiving without you" evolved into, "Is punishing us really worth spending the holidays alone?" I wasn't alone, though. I'd accepted an invitation to Thanksgiving dinner with Dr. Marshall and her family, who hosted several holiday orphans each year. The gathering included other clients without family connections, colleagues from her practice, and neighbors, a chosen family assembled through genuine care rather than obligation. The most unexpected connection came through the Breathing Room Foundation. In late November, I received an email from their development director asking if I would be willing to meet with one of their scholarship recipients who lived in Chicago. Alicia Reyes, 22, had received partial funding from the Morgan Family Scholarship for her financial planning certification. We met at a cafe near Millennium Park, the young woman immediately recognizable by the foundation tote bag she carried. Dark-haired and petite, with an earnestness that reminded me of myself at that age, Alicia gripped her inhaler in one hand as she extended the other in greeting. "Your family's scholarship is letting me finish my certification without taking a second job," she explained over coffee. With my asthma, working more than part-time during school was becoming impossible. I didn't correct her assumption about my family's philanthropic intentions, instead asking about her career goals and studies. As she described her plans to provide financial guidance in underserved communities, particularly for families navigating medical expenses, I felt a sense of purpose more satisfying than any I'd experienced in my professional life. By the time Christmas approached, I had declined my parents' increasingly desperate invitation and made plans to volunteer at a community dinner before joining Dr. Marshall's family gathering. 3 days before Christmas, a package arrived from my cousin Beth. Inside was a framed photo I'd never seen: Beth and me as teenagers, arms around each other, laughing on the very dock where Harry had pushed me months earlier. A note accompanied it: "Found this while digitizing Grandma's photos. Thought you might want a reminder that some lake memories were good ones. Miss you." Family isn't simple, but it's not all bad either. Beth had always been kind, one of the few relatives who noticed when Harry went too far. Her gesture, acknowledging my absence without demanding my return, felt like the first thread of a new kind of family connection, one based on mutual respect rather than obligation. As the new year approached, my Chicago life no longer felt temporary or reactive. It had substance, intention, community. I had become the primary architect of my experience rather than a supporting character in someone else's. The final communication of the year came from an unexpected source. My father, typically relegated to Messenger for my mother's dictates, sent an email with uncharacteristic directness. "Morgan, we received the Breathing Room Foundation's annual report. They featured the scholarship you established. 3 students received funding this year. One plans to become a financial advisor. Thought you might want to know. Dad. No demands. No guilt. Just information he thought might matter to me." It wasn't reconciliation, but it was something new, acknowledgement without condition. A small breath of possibility in a relationship I'd assumed was beyond repair. 1 year after the lake incident, Chicago had become truly home. My financial practice had grown to require 2 additional advisors, with a client list that included several of Chicago's most respected medical professionals. My apartment no longer felt new but comfortably worn in, bearing evidence of dinner parties, quiet evenings with books, and the occasional spontaneous dance session, a habit I'd never allowed myself in Boston. The invitation to speak at the Midwest Financial Advisors Conference arrived in March, a professional recognition that validated my decision to rebuild my career on my own terms. The conference was scheduled for May in Chicago's downtown convention center, featuring industry leaders from across the country. I spotted Harry immediately during the opening reception, his presence less surprising than it should have been. The financial world was ultimately small, and our professional orbits were bound to intersect eventually. He stood near the bar, still handsome in the conventional way that had always opened doors for him, though slightly less confident in his stance than I remembered. He noticed me moments later, his expression cycling rapidly through shock, anger, and finally a carefully composed neutrality. I considered avoiding the inevitable confrontation, but something in me, the same clarity that had emerged on the dock a year earlier, propelled me forward instead. "Harry," I acknowledged, stopping beside him at the bar. "Morgan," he replied, voice tight. "Didn't expect to see you here. I'm presenting tomorrow. Panel on Specialized Financial Services for Healthcare Professionals." A flicker of surprise crossed his features. "Congratulations," he offered stiffly. We stood in uncomfortable silence as the bartender prepared our drinks. Finally, Harry spoke again. "You know, you really screwed things up for me." "Did I?" I met his gaze directly. "Or did I just stop helping things be artificially easy for you?" He looked away first. "I had to take out loans for my MBA, working full-time while studying. It's been challenging." "Welcome to how most people live, Harry," I replied, not unkindly. "How most people have always lived. How I lived through my entire education." Another silence stretched between us. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its defensive edge. "Mom and Dad have been different since you left. More critical. Of me, specifically." He swirled his scotch, eyes fixed on the amber liquid. "Dad actually suggested I was entitled recently. Can you imagine?" I couldn't help the small smile that formed. Growth is painful sometimes. Is that what this was about? Teaching everyone a lesson? No, I answered honestly. It was about finally respecting myself enough to stop accepting treatment I didn't deserve. The lessons were incidental. Harry studied me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "You seem different." "I am different. I'm not orbiting around your sun anymore, adjusting my life to accommodate your gravity." He flinched slightly at the astronomical metaphor, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough." After a moment, he added, "Those scholarship kids, the ones with the breathing problems. Mom showed me their stories in the Foundation newsletter. They seemed deserving." It wasn't an apology for the lake, for years of torment disguised as humor, for the fundamental imbalance he'd benefited from our entire lives. But it was an acknowledgement, however small, that my redirection of his funds hadn't been entirely misguided. "They are deserving," I confirmed. "And now they have opportunities they wouldn't have otherwise." As we parted ways with awkward nods, I realized I felt no triumph in his discomfort, no vindication in his struggles. The revenge I'd imagined would taste sweet had transformed into something else entirely, a rebalancing that benefited others more than it punished him. 2 weeks after the conference, an email arrived from my mother. The subject line read simply, "We should talk." The message itself was brief but unprecedented. "Your father and I have been doing some reflecting since seeing Harry at the conference. He mentioned your conversation. We've also been working with a family therapist at your Aunt Patricia's suggestion. We understand if you're not ready, but we'd like to speak with you when you are. On your terms, in a way that feels safe for you." I read and reread those lines, searching for the familiar manipulative undertones, the subtle guilt tactics, the reframing of reality. They weren't entirely absent, but something new was present too, a tentative recognition of boundaries, an acknowledgement of my agency in any potential reconciliation. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I discussed it with Dr. Marshall in our next session. "What would a relationship with your parents look like if it were healthy?" she asked. Not perfect, but genuinely supportive. The question lingered with me for days. I had become so accustomed to the dynamics of our family that imagining new patterns required conscious effort. Eventually, I composed a response. "I appreciate your reaching out. I'm not ready for in-person contact yet, but I would be open to a video call with your therapist present. I have conditions for any ongoing relationship, including acknowledgement of past patterns and commitment to new boundaries. Let me know if this is something you're willing to consider." Their agreement came the next day, along with the name and credentials of their therapist. We scheduled a facilitated video call for the following week. The conversation was difficult, halting, at times painful. My mother struggled to acknowledge her role in enabling Harry's behavior without immediately qualifying it with justifications. My father retreated into silence when emotions intensified. But they were trying, genuinely trying, in a way I'd never witnessed before. "We didn't realize," my mother said at one point, "how different things were for you and Harry. It seemed normal to us because it was what we knew. When you redirected that money," my father added quietly, "it forced us to see it. The imbalance. It was always there, but we didn't have to look at it directly until you made it impossible to ignore." It wasn't complete understanding, and certainly not immediate reconciliation. But it was a beginning, a tentative first step toward a relationship based on reality rather than comfortable illusions. As spring blossomed into summer, these facilitated conversations continued. Sometimes we made progress, other times we retreated into familiar patterns. The difference was that now these patterns were named, acknowledged, challenged by the therapist and increasingly by my parents themselves. Harry participated in one session, uncomfortable but present. "I didn't see it as bullying," he admitted. "I thought it was just how brothers and sisters interacted." "It hurt me," I stated simply. Repeatedly, for years, in ways I tried to tell you about but was always dismissed for being dramatic. His discomfort was palpable, but he nodded. "I understand that now. I'm sorry, Morgan." The apology wasn't perfect, but it was real, the beginning of accountability rather than its conclusion. That summer, I launched a scholarship program through my Chicago practice, providing internship opportunities for Breathing Room Foundation recipients interested in financial careers. Alicia Reyes became our first intern, her intelligence and determination making her an immediate asset. I didn't return to Lake Winnipesaukee that year, or the next. Some distances needed to be maintained, some boundaries preserved while new relationship patterns established themselves. But I did agree to meet my parents for dinner when they visited Chicago in the fall, a neutral location, a public setting, a limited timeframe. The conversation was sometimes stilted, occasionally tense, but fundamentally different from any interaction we'd had before. As we parted, my mother asked hesitantly, "Would you consider coming for Christmas?" "Just for the day, not the whole week. Beth and her family will be there. No pressure about staying overnight." I considered the invitation, weighing the potential stress against the tentative progress we'd made. "I'll think about it," I promised, neither committing nor rejecting the possibility outright. The woman who walked away from that dinner was not the same one who had been pushed into a lake 2 years earlier. She was not defined by family expectations or limited by others' perceptions. She had created her own boundaries, established her own success, built her own community of support. The lake incident hadn't just been about Harry's cruelty or my parents' enabling, it had been the catalyst for reclaiming my own narrative. The $60,000 hadn't merely been redirected funds, it had been the price of my freedom, an investment in breaking generational patterns of favoritism and enabling. Some family wounds never heal completely, but they can transform into something different, scars that mark where we've been without determining where we're going. The journey from victim to advocate, from silence to empowered, isn't linear or clean. It's messy, complex, and ongoing. But it's worth every difficult step. If my story resonates with you, I hope it gives you courage to examine the patterns in your own relationships. Have you been accepting treatment you don't deserve? Have you been silencing your own voice to maintain someone else's comfort? What boundaries might you need to establish? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Has anyone else found themselves making dramatic changes to break free from unhealthy family dynamics? What gave you the courage to finally stand up for yourself? Please like and subscribe if this story touched you, and share it with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late to redirect your own story. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to stay and fight, but to walk away and thrive.